Ezra was not the only one that was called of God to go back to Jerusalem, to go there to strengthen and encourage God's people, but also the man Nehemiah. Nehemiah was to go back there as a governor. He was to have the administrative responsibilities, so that in the end he and Ezra teamed up together to be the administrative leader and the religious leader of the people, and one fine government of that day. It was an outstanding time because of these two outstanding men. And as we come to the book of Nehemiah, we should understand that the events in Nehemiah occur quite soon after the events of Ezra. First Ezra came and he began to instruct the people, but he had a lot of administrative problems to deal with among the people, and things were in disarray. And we're told in Nehemiah that in the time Ezra was there, before Nehemiah came, the walls were still down. While people had built their houses, they had no walls to protect the city. And raiders were coming in and they were doing their damage in the city, and it was a bad time for the people. Ezra could not handle all those things. God had sent him there to be their spiritual leader and to teach them in the Word of God. The other things, though, had to be done. And so we see how God stirred the heart of Nehemiah, just as he had Ezra's heart, to go and do what he could to help the people. Now Nehemiah, as we see, was a man of some position. He had what we would have to call a prestigious job. It was called cupbearer to the king, but in the Persian Empire, the cupbearer to the king was one of the most trusted men in the kingdom. The cupbearer to the king was to protect the king from all his enemies. And the cupbearer to the king was close to the king, and he had the responsibility of counseling the king in many matters. So it was no small position. It was undoubtedly also a very rewarding position. That is, he would have been paid very well. Nehemiah was ready and willing to leave all this, to go be with his people and suffer with them that he might help them. We'll see how all that came about. But tonight we're going to look at the first 6 chapters, and in that 6 chapters I have a small portion that we will begin with because it sets the tone here for the entire book of Nehemiah, and particularly this first section as we deal with it. That beginning point is in the 2nd chapter, in the last few verses, beginning with verse 18, going to the end of chapter 2, 18 through 20. And I've chosen for our points to think about 3 things that are said in this section. In verse 18, we read, I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. Now what Nehemiah is referring to here is he has just arrived in Jerusalem. He has just called together the people that were there, and he has been reviewing with them what happened to bring him there, how that the king had granted him leave to go, and how he had told of the king's words of encouragement to him and to them. And when the people heard and saw so evidently that God was indeed at work in the fact that Nehemiah came, and he came with great authority. Actually, he came appointed governor. So he came there with quite a lot of authority. And since he had a great reputation already in Persia, he would come with great respect on the part of many people. And the people's response is, let us rise up and build. In other words, Nehemiah, you're here and we're ready to work with you. We're ready to go. You tell us what you want us to do. Let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. The people then are ready and prepared to follow this new leader that God has sent them. And then verse 19 tells us that Sanballat the Hornite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard it. Now these are the enemy. These are people who made it their business to know what was going on in Jerusalem. They undoubtedly had many spies that were feeding them information of what these Jews were up to and what they were thinking about. And they got word pretty quickly that this prestigious man from Persia has come over, and he's telling them that I've come to build your walls, help you build your walls and defend your city. And they don't like what they hear at all. But when they heard it, we read, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, what is this thing you do? Will you rebel against the king? You can see already the beginning of their thinking. First of all, they're going to try to ridicule them. They're going to try to say, oh, who do you think you are that you can build a wall? But then, that not working, they're going to threaten them too, as Satan's methodology is. First of all, you try to ridicule, you try to verbally oppose them. If not, then you begin to plan your attack against them. And so, the second thought is they laughed us to scorn and despised us. Now, when God's people, anytime they take up the Lord's task to do it, they're going to find the enemies of God and their own enemies who laugh them to scorn, who are going to ridicule and mock them for what they try to do. Then in verse 20 you have the response of Nehemiah and those with him. Then I answered and said, the God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore, we his servants will arise and build. But you have no portion nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. So their answer in essence is, we're not intimidated by you. The God of heaven will prosper us. Three things then make up the inner workings of these chapters. The attitude of the people, let's get with it, let us rise up and build. We're ready to follow Nehemiah, our leader. The attitude of their enemies, you can't do anything. And besides, if you try to do it, we're going to see to it that the king hears that you're in rebellion against him. And then the third thing is the response of the people. They will not be intimidated. The God of heaven, he will prosper us. That's their conviction. Now, having that laid before us, let's go back to the beginning of the book and see how these things develop. Nehemiah tells us that he was in Shushan, the palace. That was the capital. That was the headquarters, as it were, of the rule of the Persian Empire. That's where the kings of Persia had lived for a long time. Nehemiah, being a Jew, said that from time to time, as certain men came back from Judah to visit Shushan, or maybe they had lived in Shushan, but they had gone to Judah. And anyway, they were coming back, and Nehemiah was concerned about how things were going there, and he asked concerning the Jews. He says, they told me that the remnant that are left, those that are there, are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and the gates are burned with fire. That's the way it was left. That's the way Nebuchadnezzar left it. And now the report is that the city is open. The enemies are able to come in. Every thief can come in. He can harass us. He can steal our goods. He can harm us. It's not safe. It's not a safe place to live. How can the people learn from Ezra if this is a condition? If they're worried about their houses, that while they're listening to him, their houses are being robbed. There's no protection. And so the thing that Ezra had gone there to do, he was not able to do, because the people could not stay long enough for instruction. Like Ezra, Nehemiah sat down and wept, and he mourned. And he said, I fasted and I prayed. He laid out, as Ezra had, the confession of sins, the acknowledgement. Look in verse 6, I and my father's house have sinned. We have dealt corruptly against you and not kept your commandments. Verse 8, you said, if you trespass, I will scatter you abroad. But if you return and keep my commandments, I will gather you together. And he reviewed again the goodness of God. And he said, these are thy people and your people you have redeemed. And I beseech you, O Lord, be attentive to my prayer and enable me to go and do something about this. He doesn't tell us what he had in mind to do. He just says at the end of chapter 1, grant him. Doesn't even say who, but we find out he's talking about the king. Grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now I was cupbearer to the king. So this gives us a setting. Here's Nehemiah, the cupbearer to the king, a prestigious man with a big office. He has a direct access to the king, and that's something that few people had. And we learned from the book of Esther that one didn't just walk in on the king. If you did, you could get your head cut off just that's quick. And yet here was a man who had access to the king every day. He was cupbearer. He was a counselor, probably a good friend. And he intended that that position that God had put him in, like long before he had put Joseph in such a similar position with Pharaoh, just as Joseph wanted his position to be for the good of God's people, that was exactly Nehemiah's view. He wanted this situation to be good for God's people. Incidentally, remember that Esther was also put in a similar position. She was to become the queen, the wife of one of the later rulers. But when she heard that there was problems, she was a bit hesitant. She wasn't sure. She wanted to stick her neck out for the people, until her cousin reminded her. He said, Esther, I want you to know this, that whether you help or not, we're going to get help. And you think about this. Could God have put you in this position, this day, for this hour? Is this why he put you here, to help your people? Well, all three of these Jewish people ended up in strategic places, in big empires, powerful empires. And ultimately, they all responded well. Nehemiah, as he stood before Artaxerxes in his day, and as he gave the wine to the king, having prayed already beforehand, the king noticed that he was a troubled man. And he inquired, saying, why is your countenance sad? Are you sick? Is this some sorrow in your heart? You see a close relationship between the king and Nehemiah. Now Nehemiah sees that God has opened the door. He says, let the king live forever. Why should I not have a sad countenance? Because I have heard about my people back in Jerusalem. And he goes into the description of all the things he's heard and why it is that he's sorry. What he wants is that the king will allow him to go down there and help these people to build up this place so that they can be protected. The king said to him that he would be pleased to send him. He asked him for an accounting of his time and how long he would be gone, and he gave him letters, and he sent him on his way, much as Ezra earlier had been sent on his way. Now Nehemiah came, he says, verse 9, he came to the governors beyond the river, and he arrived in that place, and when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Ammonite heard about it, they grieved concerning this man, that he was coming. They grieved that there was anybody who would be interested in the Israelites and want to give them any help. So he came to Jerusalem, as he records here in verse 11. And that night, after he got there, he didn't tell anybody his business. He didn't tell anybody why he had come, not even the Jewish people he had come to help. That night, he got up and he went out in the night and he went around the city and he looked at the buildings, he looked at the gates where they ought to be. He looked at the walls. He saw what an immense job of repair was necessary. He looked and surveyed the whole thing as a wise planner would do. He wanted to do it in the night, I suppose, because he didn't want any interference. He didn't want the enemy saying, hey, what have you come here to do? And he didn't even want the people to know until he had time to estimate what it was going to take and how it should be done. Then he gathered the people together, he tells us in verse 17. I said to them, you see the evil case that we're in, how Jerusalem lies waste. Come, let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. Let's do something about this. I've come to help you to build it. And this is where the passage we started with tonight comes in. And the people respond, let us rise up and build. But the news gets to Sanballat and the other enemies. These were influential men in that area of the world at that time. And they laughed. They made fun of the attempt of these weak Jews to rebuild this wall so that it could be again a well-defended city. But as we saw, Nehemiah would not be intimidated, and he would not allow his people to be intimidated. He said, the God of heaven, he will prosper us. And the people agreed, and they were ready to move on. Now, in chapter 3, we have some detail about how they went to work. And they didn't just start at one place. They started all over the place. They already knew where the gates were to go. They began to take the people and to divide the people up according to where they lived. Each family was given the responsibility for building the wall that was closest to their house. And you can see the strategy. You might not be as careful about building your neighbor's wall, but you want your wall good. You want it solid. And so Nehemiah, knowing human nature, he said, okay, you build that wall that's most important to you. And that way, he was assured he was going to have a good, strong wall. But of course, it was not that he just said, okay, just build a wall, whatever you want to. He was an engineer. He was concerned that it be done right. Constantly, he and a few men were going around that wall every day, watching, seeing what the people were doing. And basically that's what we're told in chapter 3. And so we move on to chapter 4 because the enemy comes in. And again we see that Nehemiah had to deal with all kinds of problems. And one of the problems were these threats from the enemies without. I mean by without, these were not part of Israel. This was a threat that was coming from the world to the church. Verse 1 of chapter 4, Sanballat heard that we were building, and he was angry, and he took indignation, and he mocked us. And he spake before his brothers, and he said, what are these feeble Jews doing? You can just see this group of men. They are scoffers. Psalm 1 warns against the scoffers, and it warns against our being intimidated by the scoffers or joining the scoffers. And these men are scoffing, and they're ridiculing these efforts of God's people. And as they encouraged one another, they said, ha ha, this wall they're building, even a fox could hit it and knock it down. I mean, they were ridiculing the people in every way they could, knowing that those words would get back to the Jews and hoping that it would discourage them. But note, Nehemiah lifts a prayer. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn back their reproach. Give them up for a spoil and a captive land. Don't cover their iniquity. Let their sin not be blotted out, for they provoked you to anger. That's a strong prayer. But it's no stronger than many we see in the Psalms. And what we learn, one of the things we learn about Nehemiah is how to carry on spiritual warfare. Prayer is one of the great weapons. The Word of God is one of the great weapons of spiritual warfare. Nehemiah was using them both. First, he was relying on the Word of God to encourage and strengthen the people. Secondly, he was relying on prayer. They're looking to God to fight their battles for them. They had not come there to fight battles. They'd come there to build a wall. But these people were determined to oppose them. And he did not want them discouraged. He didn't want them intimidated. And he prayed his prayer. And then in verse 6, he writes, so we built the wall. And the wall was joined halfway around, for the people had a mind to work. It was a battle for the mind. The enemies of Christ were trying to get the minds of God's servants off of what God had given them to do when he sent Nehemiah to lead them to rebuild the wall. The enemies were trying to get their minds off of that, getting them distracted by getting them into arguments with the people, or getting them intimidated, or maybe even ashamed of what they were doing. Nehemiah, to cope with that, prayed to God. Prayed to the Lord that he would encourage the people. And God did so, and the people's minds were given to God and his work. They were not given to the ridicule of the people who opposed them. The people had a mind to work. But that wasn't the end of it. Again in verse 7, Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabians, the Ammonites, all these people heard that they were repairing, and they wanted it to stop. And they conspired against them, and they were planning to come to fight against Jerusalem and cause confusion. In other words, they said, we haven't been able to scare them into quitting. Let's do everything we can. Let's rush up there. Let's threaten them. Let's attack them. Let's get them all stirred up and defensive. But look at the response again in verse 9. But we made our prayer unto God, and we set a watch against them day and night. Verse 11, our adversaries said, they shall not know, they will not see, till we come into the midst of them and slay them and cause the work to cease. Rumors were just flying back and forth. Rumors from the enemies were getting in among the people, and they were hearing these threats, and they were trying to intimidate and frighten the people. And rumors were coming out to the enemy that the people were steadfast and they were keeping on. And you can just see the battle and the warfare, the battle for the minds of the people, the battle for the glory of God that Nehemiah was fighting here, even as he was trying to get a job done. Satan will not let us do his work in a pleasant vacuum so that we can be undisturbed to do the work of God. He brings every affliction against us that he can. Paul, on one occasion, as he wrote to the Corinthians, said to them that he had a messenger from Satan. He doesn't tell us what it is. Some affliction, some hardship, some buffeting by Satan. And he asked the Lord time and again to remove it. And the Lord said to him, "No, Paul, I am more glorified by you doing my work in spite of all these things than I would be if I took all your enemies away." Same thing with the Christians in the early church when they were threatened by their enemies and told not to preach anymore. Their response was to pray to God for boldness. And you can see that same kind of a battle going on here. Our adversaries are threatening us. They're saying they'll come in and do something to us. And all the time Nehemiah was saying to the people, as in verse 14, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and terrible, and fight for your brothers, for your sons and your daughters, your wives and your houses. Go on with this wall. Until this wall is built, your families are exposed. You've got something to fight for here. You've got something to do. Verse 17, they built the wall, and those that bore burdens laded themselves, and every one with one of his hands wrought in the work, and with the other held his weapon. That's an interesting picture. These people had to defend themselves. They didn't know when the armies of their enemies might come. They had not prayed to God to just take away their enemies, but they had prayed to be steadfast and to do what God had given them to do. So, on the one hand, they had the tools with which they worked to build the wall. On the other hand, they had their weapon. They had it close at hand, in hand, ready to defend themselves if necessary. Not only that, but we're told that Nehemiah set up the situation so that he had trumpeters with him that walked with him as he went around the walls every day. No telling how many times. The walls of Jerusalem aren't that large, and in an hour or so you could walk around the walls of that day. And as he was walking around and looking, he had his trumpeter, and if there was any trouble anywhere, the trumpet would blow, and everybody would know to rush there where the trumpet was blown, so that together they could fight the enemy. So in verse 21, we wrought in the work, and half held spears from the rising of the morning till the stars appeared. In other words, all day long there were some working and some ready to defend. And he says in the end of 4, none of us put off our clothes, every one with his weapon even went to the water. It was perilous times. It was frightening times for the people. But in the midst of all of the threats and intimidations, they would not be stopped. The building of the wall went on. Now these are the threats from without.